Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, to our men's group study in the Church Dogmatics by Karl Barth, Volume 4, The Doctrine of Reconciliation. In this lesson, Barth is going to discuss the doctrine of faith, the concept of faith, as reflected off the Christ event. And he will present it in a triad of confession, correspondence, and obedience. Confession, correspondence, and obedience. If you look at block 1, we're going to look at faith as confession, and Professor Barth tells us that man is to be a witness to justification, living out the self-demonstration of justification in one's life, having a readiness for the confessing of justification and a humble and thankful spirit. So faith equals the believer's positive answer to the question of justification. That question is, where is justified man? We are to confess the objective, complete, historical atonement and pardon of God in the Christ event. We confess the objective, historical, completed atonement and pardon of God in the Christ event. The event of God's negation of the man of pride and affirmation of man as elect in God's plan of salvation. But after confession, Barth speaks even more specifically about faith in block 2. He brings up Paul, and he says Paul spoke of righteousness of faith, from faith, through faith, but never righteousness by virtue of faith. Man's faith cannot be a cooperative element in atonement. Man's faith, period, cannot have merit of its own, and it can have no cooperative status with regard to justification whatsoever. Even our faith cannot be a merited element of atonement, because the faith of man is solely the judgment and the work of God. It is, in note 3, it is solely the judgment of God's work. 1 Corinthians 12:9 even tells us that faith is a gift of the Holy Spirit. So, what about the faith that man has? What about our faith? What is it? It is not a cooperative element in the accomplishment of atonement. But even though it is not a cooperative element in the accomplishment of atonement or pardon, it still is our faith response and our faith confession. So Barth tells us in 3b that it is the logizomai. It is the faith is reckoned unto man as a human work of correspondence. It's a human confession of correspondence. So it's really God's sovereign reckoning that is taking place here. It's God's sovereign reckoning of man's faith as correspondence to the objective historical atonement of God's sole completed work. Faith is an act of correspondence, a confession of correspondence to the already completely and historically accomplished objective atonement and pardon. So God does reckon it unto humanity. He does logizomai, reckon it unto man as a faith correspondence to his sovereign atonement through his Son, Jesus Christ. So faith is our confession that humanity has been pardoned by the Father through the Son, that humanity has been pardoned by the objective, historical, and complete atonement in Jesus Christ, and that confession is reckoned by the Father unto us as a correspondence to the atonement in Jesus Christ. It's a act of correspondence, a faith action of correspondence to the Father's sovereign act of grace through the completed objective historical atonement in the Christ event. Having confessed and having had that confession reckoned as correspondence by God, we move on to the third aspect of faith as the obedience of humility. It is the obedience of humility. Barth says that faith is foundationally a free and joyful decision. It's the humility of obedience. It is a comforted despair over our limitations as finite, and yet realizing that we are affirmed in promise. So it's a comforted despair in that there is, of course, always that negation that we are limited by our pride and our finitude, and yet we are affirmed in the promise of the Christ event. So it is a comforted despair, a despair which lifts one above one's own guilt. It is in opposition to all of man's works of pride. The works of pride are absolutely negated. They have no part taking in the pardon or the atonement or the justification. It is a salvation through faith, and all of man's works of pride are negated. Justification is a process beginning with faith, completed with infused love. So faith is two-part for Barth. In note 3, it is the obedience of humility, and it is the exclusion of all works of pride. It is the obedience of humility in confession, and the exclusion of all works of pride. That's a very negative definition. It's a two-part negative definition. So in note 4, we see that faith does have a positive form, and for Barth, faith as a positive form is the imitatio Christi. Faith is the imitatio Christi. It is the humble imitation of the work of Jesus Christ. It is the self-emptying imitation of Christ. Or, as we mentioned in Block 1, it is the self-demonstration of ourselves as justified, which has been revealed in the completed atonement in the Christ event. So it's a imitation as a self-demonstration of being justified, and that imitation is imitatio Christi. That is the positive form of faith. It is the obedience and the humble imitation of Jesus Christ, His teachings, His actions, His ministry, His crucifixion, His resurrection, His willingness in obedience to the Father to enter into the humiliation of the cross, and then the verdict of resurrection, and the verdict of salvation and grace in the resurrection. So it is our self-demonstration of being justified, which has been revealed to us in the Christ event. It becomes an obedience of humility, and it becomes a confession and a correspondence to the truth of the Christ event. And it is reckoned by the Father toward us as a reckoned righteousness of correspondence. A reckoned righteousness of correspondence in our obedience of conformity and imitation, self-emptying imitation of Christ revealed to us in the Christ event. So Barth gives us a very precise view of faith as something that does not contribute in atonement whatsoever. It has no merit in itself. It is a faith action of correspondence to the already objectively completed atonement. It is a faith correspondence, a faith active correspondence to the already completed objective historical atonement in the Christ event. And that correspondence has a shape, and that shape is imitatio Christi. It's a shape, correspondence has a shape as imitatio Christi. We have a correspondence of faith to the already accomplished, full, complete, objective historical atonement in Jesus Christ, and that correspondence is shaped in our active imitation of self-emptying of all pride and humble conformity and imitation of Jesus Christ. So it becomes very much that realm of the Spirit correspondence. Faith for Barth is that realm of the Spirit correspondence. It is a confession. It is a action confession, really, if you want to put it precisely. It is our active, self-demonstrating confession of being justified. So it is a faith as verb, not faith as noun. And it is faith as a verb of our active confession of being justified in Jesus Christ. And then that is reckoned unto us as a righteousness by the Father. And then we move on to imitatio Christi. Imitatio Christi, of imitating the Christ of the Christ event. It gives us a very precise discussion of the concept of faith by Professor Barth, a discussion of faith as an faith action response of corresponding to the Christ event, an act of correspondence to the Christ event as active imitation, active self-emptying of pride and imitation of Christ and the Christ event. So faith is verb. Faith is an active verb action of correspondence. And it does not have merit in itself. It is reckoned, merit is reckoned unto man as righteousness by the Father in that action of logizomai in Block 2, where faith is reckoned unto man as a work of correspondence. The Father logizomai reckons unto man this recognition of his work of correspondence. So there is the sovereign act of God, the Father's reckoning of this action of faith, but it is always a confession as an action. It is always confession as imitation. Confession as imitation of the Christ event, of imitatio Christi. It's the faith of imitatio Christi that is taken up by the believer, and it is a self-corresponding active confession of faith in Jesus Christ. Very precise definition and discussion of faith by Professor Barth as a definition which is really one of taking up faith as action verb, and only as action verb of correspondence. And that leaves us just one very minor closing lesson for paragraph 61 coming up next time, and we will pick that up. It will begin at page 116.